Two questions, if I may. One, I noticed in your petition to the appellate court in D.C., you haven't asked for an injunction. Is that something you might seek later, or is it part of the petition process that the court might stay any further action by the EPA? And second question is, given the Supreme Court ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA that started all this, is it safe to assume that there is no constitutional challenge remaining on this issue? Thanks.
I think really what we're talking about here are policy issues, and we don't have a role to play in the setting of the policy, but then also simply abiding by standards of administrative law that have been in place for years in America. I wouldn't say that we have any constitutional challenges we're bringing at this point. Actually, let me throw one in, and that is that Congress has the authority, long accepted authority, to delegate to agencies the ability to make rules. For instance, they can identify an area and put parameters around it, and then assign to an executive agency the duty to flesh out the details. You can say here that the Clean Air Act is that direction from Congress. The EPA has in turn delegated what the EPA itself has identified, the core element of this finding, to another body, and not done what appears to be any significant, or at least not successful, oversight of the process. This goes back to my comment about redelegating. That is potentially challengeable on a constitutional basis. So that would be the one potential constitutional issue. Thank you, Joe.
Piggybacking on that,
Yeah.
is it your intention to grant Virginia exception to this, to what the EPA is doing, or is it you're trying to have the EPA go back to the drawing board nationally?
Well, they don't do this for one state or another. It's all or nothing. And what I would call our priority request is that they reopen the record and do this process again correctly, rather than going to court, fighting about it. I mean, all we fight about there is, did they do the process properly? If we prevail, as we would hope to, then it gets sent back to EPA anyway. Why don't we cut that off and get back to where we need to do a good, run a good scientific process, or they need to, and start at that point. That would bypass the court. The court filings would then suddenly become moot, if for no other reason than the EPA goes back and does this again. Now, if they don't improve that process, we may have the same concerns. However, one would think if they're going to go back and reopen that record, that the point is to avoid those concerns. That's what we'd hope they would do.
With the Times Dispatch, Rex Frankston, I want to follow up what she asked. You mentioned that you don't see global warming in the past several years. I want to make sure I follow you. The premise is that the Earth's been warming for decades, and that mankind is largely responsible. Do you take issue with that?
What I take issue with is the notion that that has been analyzed in any meaningful and objective way that a conclusion like that can be drawn. And I think that the revelations of the last 2 or 3 months have made it very clear that those of us who were wondering why some of the things were proceeding as they were can now see that, in fact, that the people driving the train were not doing so in the objective manner that people assume occurs in the scientific community. That this was, whether it was preconceived or conceived in midstream, the folks who were in charge of putting this data together that is so important, and analyzing it, that is so important in the conclusions that not just the United States but other countries around the world are drawing or on the verge of drawing. We're not doing this in an objective manner. They were not doing it in a transparent manner. In fact, quite the opposite. They were working together to hide conclusions and data that they didn't feel supported the conclusions that they wanted. And if you're talking about science and conclusions you want, you're already talking about bad science. And that was clearly what was going on here. And this happened in the United States, it happened around the world. But it was organized outside of the U.S. The EPA relied on the analysis in its finding, and we believe that that flaw is one that cannot be overcome without going back to the drawing board and doing this again. And looking at the raw data and looking at it objectively and letting both sides of the academic or scientific debate weigh in without trying to squeeze one side or the other out, as has happened here. So